and or not, because I should get it in the other one there, and I didn't. Oh, it did. Okay. Um, and so we this was established by the Review of Keynesian Economics. Normally, I would have here a big banner from Elgar behind that. I don't have that. I'm sorry to say. But I did print a little bit of. Let me I'm admitting more people, uh, and um, and please, I ask as you get in, mute yourselves because I'm not going to be able to while I speak make sure that everybody's muted. So we as I was saying, this was established 4 years ago by, and I apologize, I keep admitting, so there's no way of me sharing this. I'm meeting people as I speak. 4 years ago, by the Review of Keynesian Economics, with an intent of something that was part of the sort of idea of the journal, which I think matches some of the views that Mark has, an idea of big tent, post-Keynesianism, the idea that it encompasses all sort of Keynesian tribes. Of course, and we have had those conversations. How much do we include mainstream, Keynesians within the group? The journal has tried to certainly make conversations with people in the mainstream, bring them into the fore, and made some of the relevant contributions of post-Keynesians and others Keynesians. And in that respect, the Godley Tobin lecture tries to promote exactly that, and picks Tobin as a reasonable Keynesian within the mainstream, and Wynne as a sort of symbolic of the same sort of willingness to talk on a more heterodox approach. The first Godley Tobin lecture was given by James Galbraith, that reminded me the other day, and I think James is here. He reminded me that he pioneered the virtual lecture, because his lecture in Boston, he couldn't arrive because of the snow, and it was recorded. So that's how it happened the first time. We were lucky the following two that we actually had those in person. Let me say a few things about Marc Lavoie. So Marc is now a professor emeritus, and I'm going to repeat what I said before. It's sort of slightly scary because it says something about me too. Marc is professor emeritus of both University of Ottawa and the University of Sorbonne, Paris Nord. Marc is, well known. I don't have to, tell you much about his contributions to post-Keynesian economics. I will suggest that there are two books that are really influential, I think, and have been for the profession, but in particular for heterodox economics. His book on the new version of the manual on post-Keynesian economics, called Post-Keynesian Economics: New Foundations. I particularly like the new edition because he actually does cite me as a group of heterodox Keynesians that cannot be easily classified because they are in more of one of those categories, and he puts me in the same category. I wouldn't put myself in this category, but with Philip Orestes, Jeff Harcourt, John King, Barclay Rosser, Ed Nell, Stephen King, Matthew Forstater, and LP Rochon. So it's I'm in great company there, and I appreciate that Marc put me and cited me there. And Marc then also published in when was it? 2007, Marc, or 2006?
Yes.
2007. Yes, that's what I thought. In the Monetary Economics: An Integrated Approach to Credit, Money, Income Production, and Wealth, with Wynne Godley. In my view, there are two co-authors of Wynne. Wynne had several co-authors, of course, but I think there are two co-authors that are representative of what the work that Wynne Godley did, and that I think were his sort of central, collaborators. One is, of course, Francis Cripps, and with whom he wrote the first sort of manual back in the early 80s, which was based on his work at the Cambridge Applied Economics sort of group, department. And of course, the other is the work with Mark that started after he had come to the Levy Institute, and they sort of started collaborating on stock flow models. I think again, I'll remind everybody to mute themselves as they get in, and so Mark will talk to us about exactly the Tobin, Godley versus Tobin on monetary issues. So I think it's a theme that it's very apropos. And I already exceeded the time, and I apologize because I've been trying to do two things at the same time. And so without further ado, we'll have Mark. Mark, I'm not going to stop you. You have about 40 minutes and we should have time at the end. I'm more than happy if the Easterns do not kick us out to continue for a while. So while Mark is willing to respond to your questions, I'm happy to remain here. I'm going to try to be the police here and avoid, for those that arrive later, we did have a few bombs, and so I'm going to try to control that doesn't happen. If it does happen, or if there are on any other issues, I apologize beforehand. As I said, this is not my account, but I'll get in immediately again if something happens. Mark.
Okay, so I'll start by trying to share the screen. Okay, so that should be all right. So thank you very much, Matthias, and many thanks also to Tom and Esteban for this invitation. I'll start by telling you how I'm going to proceed. So I'll make a few anecdotes to start with. So I'll be doing my little Jeffrey Harcourt here. Then I'll be discussing how people perceived Wynne Godley and James Tobin either as Keynesian or non-Keynesian economists. Then I'll be talking about the main topic, so to speak, is both authors were very much involved with stock flow consistent modeling. So I'll be talking about what does that mean and what are the differences of the two approaches of Godley and Tobin, and then a specific section I'll be talking about their views about banks and the monetary system. I should add to start with that I have a very biased view because, as Matthias said, I did work extensively with Wynne for about 6 or 7 years in the 2000s, whereas this was not at all the case with respect to Tobin. So, right, I met or I saw Tobin only twice. The first time was when he made a presentation at Carleton University, which is the rival university of the university in Ottawa, where when he came, this was around 1980 or 1981, he was trying to defend old Keynesianism against the attacks made by new classical economists, Lucas in particular. And the second time I saw Tobin was, I think it was 1987, when there was this crash at Wall Street, and there was a 3-day meeting in New York City and at the Levy Institute. And so I did comment on his work in that occasion with Tobin being present. A few anecdotes on my predecessors. So James Galbraith, I've known for many years. I have great admiration for him because he's always been defending the idea of the dual mandate for the Fed, and my colleague Mario Sekarecha and I have been pushing for the dual mandate at the Bank of Canada, and we hope to be successful this year. The second thing which is peculiar about James, at least from my perspective, is that he's one of the very rare American economists who can do a full presentation in French, which is my mother tongue. So he's a courageous man to advocate, to admit that he can speak French, because as you know, very often for politicians, this is seen as a bad sign, to say that you speak French or you look French. Robert Rothorn, well, I've never met. I was in Cambridge in 1985, was visiting there for 3 or 4 weeks, and I intended to go and to his lecture. So as I was going up the stairs to go to the room where he was giving it.
Oh. Mark, you're mute. Mark, you're mute. Sorry, I was muting somebody and I accidentally.
Okay, so I was saying that I wanted to go to the a lecture being done by Robert Rothorn in 1985. And as I was walking up the stairs, Jeffrey Harcourt arrived with John Eatwell and said, "Oh, I'm so happy you're going to listen to John Eatwell in the room which was right next to the one where Rothorn was." And being shy, I didn't dare to say, no, I wanted to go to listen to Rothorn. So I went to listen to John Eatwell. So I missed Rothorn in that occasion. Robert Schiller, I only saw once as well, and that was at a meeting of the Eastern Economic Association. I don't know the exact date, but probably around 2003 or something. And he was making a presentation well, on the expectations. It was in fact an extension of his earlier book that had been published around 1999 or 98. And the only other person I knew in the room was Ed Nell. And after the presentation of Robert Schiller, I told Ed Nell, well, Schiller is a closet post-Keynesian. I really had the impression that he kept talking about emotions, animal spirits, feelings and all that. And I thought, well, here is a closet post-Keynesian. I should tell also how I did not meet Wynne Godley in 1985. I only met him 14 years later in 1999. And what happened is that when I arrived at Cambridge, I asked a few people, and so I got the chance to meet, for instance, Nicholas Caldor. But when I mentioned the name of Godley, I was told by someone there, don't you waste your time meeting this old fool. So again, being shy, I didn't dare push more. And in fact, if I had been to the lecture of Robert Rothorn, maybe he would have introduced me to Wynne Godley. And finally, I met Wynne Godley in 1999. And that was because 4 of us were reading his paper that had been published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and there were a couple of equations we just couldn't see how he got there. So I sent an email to Wynne Godley and I said, well, here are 4 full professors who cannot understand this equation. And so he wrote back and said, well, the reason you cannot understand is that there's a mistake in the equation. And that's how we ended up meeting, came to Ottawa, and then I went to the Levy Institute. Okay, so the next question is, there's been in the past some questions about whether they really are Keynesian economists, both of them. So how about Godley? Well, some people may have heard of this controversy that happened in 1974. On one side was the new Cambridge school or new Cambridge model, with Francis Cripps, Coutts, Wynne Godley. And on the other side, there were the standard Italo-Cambridge Keynesians. And so people like Richard Kahn were kind of wondering whether the Cambridge economics group was really Keynesian or not. And for instance, here I have this sentence by Robert Dixon, who is himself post-Keynesian from Australia, who wrote in 1982-83, there can be no doubt that both in its analytical core and in its policy assignment, doctrines associated with the new Cambridge school, which is Wynne Godley, represent a dramatic break with the ideas of Keynes. And about the same time, there was the centenary Keynes conference in Cambridge, where Wynne Godley presented. And there were some comments, you can find them in the book that collects all the presentations and the comments. There was a comment that Godley's model had a real whiff of monetarism about it. And Francis Cripps, who, as Matthias said, was the co-author of Wynne Godley with this book in 1983, said, had to claim that what they were doing, Godley and Cripps, was Keynesian monetary economics. Some might say that, well, maybe there was some truth with it, because Wynne, with a colleague of his, attended the Carnegie Rochester 1977 conference, which is a conference where monetarists would meet. And his paper was very badly received. There were complaints about the fact that he had a model where the real interest rate was pegged, that the model rejected the standard Mundell-Fleming results. And so people like Robert Hall told him, well, Wynne, you should read Tobin's portfolio theory, because he's got a lot to say about this link between the real and the monetary side. And Robert Solow said exactly the same thing in that Keynes Centenary Conference in 1983. In the end, Tobin visited the Department of Applied Economics in Cambridge in 1984. And so this is how they connected. How about Tobin? Tobin wrote in 1983 that he was wearing the label Keynesian with pride. So obviously he considered himself as a Keynesian. Robert Diamond, who was a student of Tobin at Yale, said the same, and points out that the people that were closest to Tobin were, in fact, people that we can certainly characterize as having a Keynesian background. So Okun, Brainerd, Ray Fair, Robert Schiller, Nordhaus, who in fact was a co-author of Wynne Godley in their book on pricing. I think, one way to summarize Tobin perhaps is to say, well, he was a defender of the neoclassical synthesis, but with more attention to monetary issues. Another thing we can say is that his famous Tobin's Q model is very close, at least in my view, from what Paul Davidson and Minsky were writing about the relationship between investment and the stock market value of shares of firms. Minsky did a review of the book by Tobin in 1981, where he claimed that Tobin was saying, well, I'm reviewing current macroeconomic theory, and this annoyed very much Minsky, who did a very negative review of the book, claiming, I suppose, that, well, there was nothing about post-Keynesian theories. So maybe Tobin should have said, well, I'm reviewing current mainstream macro theory and not current macro theory. According to Robert Diamond, there were 4 key Keynesian propositions in the work of Tobin. Excess demand impacts quantities, so not just prices. Downward rigidity produces unemployment. Investment is volatile. In particular, optimism plays an important role. And probably the key, the most Keynesian proposition is a falling price level is contractionary. It's going to lead to a quantity recession. It's also sometimes called the Fisher effect. One reading works on policy, one can see that Tobin did accept the idea of hysteresis and was arguing in favor of prudent expansionary fiscal policies. So that's Keynesian. But on the other hand, he was blaming all the European problems on real wage rigidities. So that was not Keynesian. But as I said, and that was obvious when I saw him in 1980, 1981, he did his best to stop all these ideas coming out from Friedman, Barrow, Lucas, rational expectations. It was all very much against this. Let's go now to stock flow consistent models. So as Wynne has often written, if you have a formal model, there shouldn't be any black holes. For instance, if you assume that there are reserves in the system, well, there should also be a government sector in your model, which seems obvious, but is not always the case. Now, Nikiforos and Zedza, in a paper, in a survey of SFC models, have described what these Godley style models are. It combines a demand-led closure and a sophisticated and realistic treatment of the financial side of the economy. So that's their way to summarize what SFC means, at least from the Godley point of view. Now, in the past, either Wynne or myself or us together, we came up with different expressions to indicate this. Real stock flow monetary model, mixing the real side and the flow side, the monetary side. Coherent stock flow monetary framework, to emphasize that the coherence is not just the link between new investment and the increase in capital, or sectoral monetary stock flow consistent approach, to emphasize that there should be more than one sector. But the name that has stuck is the one that was proposed by Claudio dos Santos in his PhD thesis at the New School. But in his thesis, he points out that, well, this SFC approach was also promulgated by various Keynesian individuals in the 1970s and 1980s. Robert Diamond annoyed me a little bit because in his book on Tobin, he links what Tobin has done to current work, and he mentions the work, rightly so, he mentions the work of Peter Flaschel, Azada, Chiarella, who passed away recently, and Willy Zemler. But he doesn't mention at all all this Godley style SFC models. well, the problem with the name stock flow coherent is that it seems to imply that there's a lot of other models out there which are not stock flow coherent. For instance, the question is, what about DSG models? Are they stock flow coherent? Well, I would argue that in a way they are, in that sense, in the sense of linking the increase in investment to, linking investment to the increase in the stock of capital. But I would say that they are incoherent in the sense that there is no banking system. And as I said, there's a money supply that may be there, but you don't know where it comes from. Anyway, as I say in the last sentence of the slide, it is probably too late to change the name. So this is the name that we are stuck with. So what's the history here in between Godley and Tobin? Well, in the book of Godley and Cripps, published in 1983, it's obvious that they were already aware of this work being conducted by Tobin and his other Keynesian colleagues at Yale University and others, Deuter, Tarnowski, Blinder, and Solo. But they thought that their analysis was overly complicated, and they thought that their analysis lacked realistic behavioral assumptions. So in 1984, Godley wrote that there's a lot of complex and opaque mathematical paraphernalia. And in their book, they said that these other Keynesian, say old Keynesian models, could only give vague and complicated answers to simple questions like how money is created and what functions it fulfills. So such questions tend to produce tormented replies. So they were not really convinced, but as I said, Tobin went to the Department of Applied Economics at Cambridge in '84. And from there on, Godley and his collaborators tried very hard to introduce Tobin's portfolio approach. So it took a bit of time. It's only 12 years later, in 1986, in his working paper at the Levy Institute, that one can say that Godley managed to really completely integrate Tobin's portfolio approach into his own view, which was more on a view of money as a flow and based on credit. By the way, I should say that it's Anwar Sheikh who came to Ottawa that year and told me about this working paper and told me, well, I'm sure you will be very much interested by Godley's working paper. So that's how I became aware of that. And Godley recognizes this. In that working paper, he says that my debt to Tobin is enormous. I could not possibly have made this model without his work, particularly on asset choice. And then later in 1999, the way this has been modeled owes everything to the work of James Tobin. In 1998, there was a book that was published by Tobin and I think a former student of his, Golub. And when Wynne saw that, he was very much scared. He thought that Tobin would play on him the trick that Keynes had played on Schumpeter when Schumpeter was trying to write his book on money, and the trick also that Keynes played on Kalecki, in the sense that both authors, Schumpeter and Kalecki, got the impression that Keynes had written the book that they wanted to write. Schumpeter, because of Keynes' book on the treatise on money in 1930, and Kalecki because of the general theory of Keynes in 1936. But in the end, looking at the book, there was nothing really new compared to what Tobin had written 10 years or 20 years later, at least from the standpoint of Wynne Godley. So what are the main features of SFC modeling in Godley's view? And I've discussed this with a few people. And I think one can say that perhaps the most important is that Godley's SFC models provide a fully explicit traverse towards the next stationary or steady growth state. So that would be the big difference between Godley and Tobin, as I will expand a bit later. The models fully integrate a monetary flow analysis with a portfolio analysis. So the first one links money to expenditure and income. So that's the flow side, so to speak, of money, and especially the flow side of credit. And he linked this with the portfolio analysis, which is really Tobin's contribution, where you have various demand functions for the various assets. But because Godley has this traverse, he shows visually through simulations how flows and stocks change gradually in line with each other through time. And so you can see this in the short run, in the medium run, and the long run, anytime you change a parameter. And so I would argue, and other people have argued before, like Antonio Macedo, that these SFC models are a true illustration of Kalecki's statement to the effect that the long-run trend is but a slowly changing component of a chain of short-period situations. So that's why I felt very much at ease with working with Wynne on these models. So Godley's models can simultaneously determine the evolution through time of the stock of money and wealth by households and the flows of credit, investment, consumption, and income. By contrast, if you look at the works of Tobin, you have the impression that all the attention is on one period models. Often there is a steady state solution, but how it will be reached is not being told. And essentially what Tobin does is to study how the economy evolves as agents slowly adjust their portfolios towards their desired portfolio and no more. So all the action is, he assumes there is somehow a change in the desired portfolio, or it starts from a situation where the desired portfolio has not been achieved. And then he explains how the economy will move towards that desired portfolio. And so Randall Wray, in an article on various strands of endogenous money, has said that in Tobin's approach, flow variables are exogenous so that the models focus solely on portfolio decisions. And I think that's a good summary. Okay, and then there are many other features that we can say about Godley's stock flow consistent approach. They are demand-led. Well, Nikiforos and Gennaro Zezza have already said that. Market clearing through prices only occurs in some specific financial markets. So it's mainly about quantity adjustment. They rely on procedural rationality, where agents react to past disequilibria relative to some norm. For instance, firms have an inventory to sales ratio as a target. So, okay, households make their consumption and portfolio decisions sequentially, which is in fact, as is being done in the paper of Bacchus, Brainard, Tobin, and Smith. But that's and in fact, that paper, this Bacchus, Brainard, Smith, Tobin paper, is the one that was the greatest inspiration to Wynne Godley. Households can make mistakes, they make errors in expectations, and cash money or money deposits act as a buffer. So the role of buffers is very important for the work of Wynne. And another buffer, of course, are the inventories of firms. Firms must take a production decision. They must decide on fixed capital and inventory investment. They must make costing and pricing decisions. The price is not set by the market. It is being set by firms, and the same with respect to financial decisions. Let's move on now to banks and the money supply process. There's a common feature for Godley and Tobin. They both assume that there is imperfect substitutability between financial assets. So this assumption is coming back now in models, but for a long time, perfect substitutability was being assumed by almost everyone, except post-Keynesians. Now there's here is perhaps an essential difference is that Tobin saw banks as no different from other financial intermediaries, and he relied on a variant of the variable money multiplier story. So here he was much more mainstream or standard. I mean, so whereas on the other hand, Godley had a vision of monetary matters based as banks as creators of loans. So the emphasis of Godley is the need for loans in order to enable firms to produce and have inventories. So it's linked to the post-Keynesian endogenous money supply view, where reserves are supplied on demand at the target interest rate set by the central bank. And this, of course, is in the endogenous money tradition of Kaldor, Moore, Graziani, and the whole monetary circuit theory. When Godley was very much in tune with Augusto Graziani, they had a very similar view of the monetary circuit. And yeah, I emphasized that the view that Godley had, say, in the 1980s with Francis Cripps or later, is the view which is now defended by central bankers. If we look more in detail in Godley, as I said, the predominant role of banks is to create loans. That's their main role in society, so to speak. They have to provide credit to firms who carry on production. And Godley's banks are Kaldorian in the sense that they respond to the financial needs of their credit-worthy clients. And this was already in the book with Francis Cripps. I mentioned Graziani, and certainly one can say that Godley's SFC models are consistent with the theory of the monetary circuit, according to which production must be initially financed by bank loans to get the ball rolling. And in that sense, Godley, just like Graziani and the monetary circuitists, they make the distinction between initial finance and final finance, or sometimes it's called construction finance. For instance, Paul Davidson talks of construction finance as initial finance and funding corresponding to final finance. Sorry. Um, Gennaro Zezza, who has been a longtime collaborator of Win Godley, has said it. He says, at the heart of the theory of the monetary circuit is the notion shared by Godley that production requires time and that cost of production have to be paid before receipts from sales can be obtained. Here we'll have 3 slides about Tobin's view of banks. Well, his view is different. His view is that banks, like households, are assumed to make portfolio asset choices based in particular on rates of return. So they will do that between free reserves, loans, government bills. Looking at their asset side, they will make choices. So the loans at least seem to play no special role in this approach. They have no priority. Banks could be just another non-banking financial institution. Also, Robert Diamond has said, and agreeing with my feeling about Tobin's view, that for Tobin, the central bank sets the monetary base outside, therefore, what is called outside money. That is currency plus reserves with zero, otherwise exogenously fixed rate of return, and then optimizing financial institutions create financial assets, including inside money. So what is endogenous in Tobin's works is the money multiplier or the velocity of money. So he does not really have this reverse causation that the post-Keynesians have. Diamond says Tobin models money creation by optimizing banks to derive an upward sloping supply curve for money. Higher interest rates will induce banks to create more money by choosing lower reserve deposit ratios. So what you really have is a variable money multiplier or variable velocity of money. And Tobin, I think, puts it even in a clearer way. He says, in Tobin, bank lending remains completely invisible and is attributed no role in the money supply process. So though the money supply is endogenous, the monetary base remains exogenous, which is what gives the model its verticalist character. And again, Ray on this, Tobin's approach really does not deviate significantly from the exogenous approach in which deposits make loans. Whereas as we know in post-Keynesian theory, loans make deposits. And Godley has a statement of his own in another working paper at the Levy Institute of 1997, where he says, Tobin never makes the final step, essential to my story, where bank loans are required to enable industry to function at all. The raison d'etre of Tobin's banks, so far as I can see, is to enlarge the asset choice of households and facilitate the agility with which it can be made. So finally, a last slide on Tobin. As some of you may know, in 1963, Tobin wrote an article where he was discussing what he called the new view of banking and the old view of banking. And so his new view of banking, which has been quite influential, is that even though banks can create credit ex nihilo, thanks to excess reserves, they are no different from non-banks since they are subjected to the same funding constraints, as they must convince agents to modify the composition of their portfolio. So both post-Keynesian authors today and mainstream authors today blame Tobin's paper on the old view and the new view of banking for having played a critical role in establishing the intermediation of loanable funds view of Gurley and Shaw as the new dominant paradigm. So this is a statement from Jacob and Kumhoff, who is now at the Bank of England and formerly from the IMF. So, I mean, what's the difference between banks and non-bank financial institutions? The difference is that when non-banks acquire assets, they must obtain outside financing to start with at the very first stage. So if you want, they must get initial finance from somewhere else. When banks borrow, well, this may happen indeed, but this will only happen in the second stage, in the funding stage or the final finance stage. So that's the main, that's the way I see the difference between banks and non-banks. So it is true that non-banks can make credit, but in order to do so, they must get initial finance from someone else or from banks. So here I can conclude. Both authors were very much concerned with monetary matters and wanted to make this relationship between the real side and the financial side. So deal with the integration of the real side and the financial side, which is something that people, I mean, when I went to Paris as a graduate student in 1976, this was something that everybody was talking about, but that nobody was achieving. Both were into stock flow consistent modeling, but I would argue that Godley's version is better. It's more realistic. It provides a traverse of all the flows and stocks. Godley has a circuitous view of the post-Keynesian endogenous money theory, where banks play a crucial role in providing initial finance, with central banks playing a defensive role, which is something which is now emphasized by modern monetary theory and also was emphasized a lot by Alfred Eichner in the 80s before he passed away. And Tobin's new view, which is the one that he has advocated all along, relies on a variable money multiplier view, where banks must first access excess reserves from the central bank and then are subjected to the same funding constraints as other financial intermediaries. So one would have the impression that Tobin's view, where he put so much emphasis on the necessity to respond to the constraints of people moving around their assets from one financial institutions to another, would be the most appropriate to understand shadow banking as it exists now. One would tend to think, well, this is the most appropriate theory to understand shadow banking. But in my opinion, no. Shadow banks is misnamed. They are different from banks. They do not have this key feature of bank, which is the ability to create loans by themselves. And so I still believe that Godley's view, or if you want, the standard post-Keynesian monetary view, is the most appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So we now can sort of open up. I know that some people have included, if you stop, I think it would be better if you stop sharing the...
Did I stop it? Or?
No, it's, well,
No. Okay.
So I have at least one.
All right.
So we can see each other, everybody. So I have one question here. I think that, the new feature with Zoom, and I assume if you have it, so if you use your hand, and I see James already used it, you'll be pushed up to the top and I'll be able to unmute you. So I'm going to read the question by Mark Pilkington, then I'm going to mute. I'm already going to allow Jamie to unmute himself whenever he can, and then he'll give you his own question. And if other people want to, please just raise your hand with the feature. It has, a feature that says, raise your hand. So Mark Pilkinson's question is, there have been recent attempts by mainstream DSGE models to model shadow banking dynamics, which I find peculiar as they do not usually feature a well-defined banking sector in the first place. In contradistinction, does Mark think that there exists a rationale for defining the shadow banking system as full-fledged institutional sector in the SFC models instead of amalgamating the traditional banking sector and the shadow banks for the sake of convenience and just adding a few equations to try to account for the latter?
Yeah, do I answer one by one, or?
Let's accumulate. I mean, we have Jamie waiting there, and there might be a few others.
No, go ahead.
You want to answer? So yes. So Mark.
Okay, so well, there are already people who are attempting to, or who are indeed doing it, who have SFC models where with a shadow banking system which is separate from the banking system. Well, why not? I'm all for it. I mean, Win and I did not do it, but that was because the book was written before 2008. Yeah, there are people like Alberto Botta and his colleagues who have done so, and others. And I think it's a good idea. And, it's putting in more institutional stuff into our SFC models, getting SFC models closer to the strand of post-Keynesian institutionalism.
Thank you, Mark. So we have first Jamie, and then Tom Michael, which I think I already allowed you to unmute. I'll remind everybody, just raise your hands.
Okay, I just wanted to make a personal comment and thank you for a truly remarkable presentation, which bears in a very direct way on my personal experience. I arrived in Cambridge as my first serious exposure to graduate level economics in 1974, and therefore to Caldor, and that was, I think, the year 74, 75 when Win first came up from the Treasury to the DAE. And then I went from there to the Banking Committee of the House of Representatives, and only after that to Yale, where, of course, I encountered Tobin. But I never actually, because of flukes of timing, took Tobin's courses. And having already been exposed to the Caldor and what ultimately became the Godley perspective, I could never make any sense, head nor tail, of the Tobin-Brainerd approach until just now. And you've put the whole thing into perspective for me. And I must say, I feel very fortunate that over 45 years, I've managed to escape having that as the foundation of my insight into monetary economics, as opposed to the one I was fortunate to receive. En fait, un discours remarquable d'une lucidité étonnante. Je vous remercie. Hein?
Oui. Well, yes, as I said, James is always willing to talk in French when he's getting invited in France or in Quebec. So I'm very grateful for this. And actually, Win arrived at Cambridge, I think, in 1970. So it was 3 years before, 3 or 4 years before you were.
Yep. Okay.
Well, merci, but that's the extent of my French. So we'll have Tom Michael, I think, in English. You have to unmute yourself. I did. Let's see. I'll ask again. You're muted.
Now I'm unmuted. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just second that. That was a delightful and and stimulating talk. Thanks, Mark. I just have three quick questions. One is, Tobin had this Q theory, which he embedded in neoclassical economics, and it was really dependent on sort of marginal productivity. But it seems to me that there's a really valid role for some kind of Q theory of investment, separate from that whole sort of marginal productivity production function approach. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what Godley would have said about how stock prices affect investment, or if you have some thoughts of your own, just in general. Because I've actually been working on a model in which the Q ratio plays a major role, and I think the fact that you can have a non-neoclassical theory of investment that involves Q, maybe along Minsky lines or something, is to me it's exciting. The second question I have is, I saw Tobin once. It was at the Levy Institute, and he was banging on about the policy mix, the need to recognize that in the long run you can manage public debt by having a tight fiscal policy combined with a loose monetary policy. And I think that actually was a theme in his in his life. And I wonder if you comment on that part of his work, because of course modern monetary theory has basically rejected the idea of a policy mix with their advocacy for something like a zero interest rate rule. And the final question is, it seems to me Tobin, neoclassical, he recognized that the long run, it's a labor constrained system, whereas I'm guessing Godley he was much more Keynesian, but I wonder what his views were on the supply constraints in the long run in capitalist economies. And finally, just and related to that, you mentioned Tobin believed in hysteresis, which I think is huge. And I'm just curious how he saw that, because it's really quite corrosive to the whole neoclassical project. So that's all.
Okay, well, that's a lot of questions. Let me start from the end and move back up. Tobin and hysteresis. If I remember well, it was in a series of lectures that were done by various people at the University of Dalhousie, organized by John Cornwall, who was the mentor of Mark Satterfield. So if you send me an email, I can give you the exact reference. About the labor constraint, Godley was one of the very few people in the 1980s who did not believe in the Phillips curve. Even the short-run Phillips curve, the downward sloping one, he said, well, it may be true on some occasions, but not necessarily true all the time. So I think it fits well with people now saying that the Phillips curve is flat. About the policy mix, well, I would agree with Tobin's mix. I mean, if there has to be a mix of compensation, I would also go for tight fiscal policy and very low rates of interest, because the other mix, which is expansionary fiscal policy with very high interest rates, which means, large deficits, high interest rates, led to the catastrophe that we had in the 1980s, in the sense that we had those rates of interest at 20%. The fiscal policy was relatively expansionary, and so the debt exploded. And there were some, I have a Canadian colleague of mine whose name I will not mention, who said, anybody who does not believe that the right policy mix is expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy and very high interest rates is a fool. And then finally about Q theory, well, yes, as I said, Paul Davidson, Hyman Minsky have something that looks very much like Tobin's Q theory, but for slightly different reasons. As you say, it may be based on non-neoclassical reasons. But it seems to me that empirically, there's not much evidence that this Q ratio plays any role once you include the rate of utilization and so on. So, I mean, okay, so that would be my answer.
Okay, we have two questions that are on the chat. So I'm going to read the first by Leonardo Vera from Venezuela. And Leonardo asks, Mark, thank you, excellent. A simple question. To what extent does Tobin's vision of an endogenous multiplier motivated by portfolio decisions and Godley's vision of endogeneity of money and the monetary base complement each other? Yeah,
well, of course, you can always put the two together, but it seems to me that the most essential one, I mean, they both probably exist, but the essential one is the reverse causation argument. I mean, if you think about Kaldor, when he made his presentation to the Radcliffe Committee, essentially he's presenting a variable velocity endogenous view of money, and Minsky as well. But I think, if we're looking at what's important, most important is this reverse causation argument. And it's quite obvious today with the way central bankers are working now. But of course, you can also have endogenous velocity.
Okay, we have another question from Esteban Perez, and I think there's a couple more entering there. So let me read the one from Esteban. Can you please comment on the differences between Tobin and Godley relative to the neutrality of money? Relative to the neutrality. Isn't Tobin model in the end a Vixelian model? Financial events can reduce risk, I suppose, the Tobin Q, the yield that investors require to hold equity capital. This is the only linkage in the model through which financial events, including monetary policies, affect the real economy. And I think that might have been a quotation from Brainerd and Tobin, or
Well, I've never thought too much about it, but if someone is interested in this question, then he ought to read the book of Colin Rogers that was published in 1989. And that's exactly what he's looking at. He's looking at the Vixelian model and showing there are some similarities with Tobin's Q model and criticizing both of them.
Wait a second. Fernando is just saying goodbye.
And if this person writes to me, Stefan writes to me, I can send him the reference. The book of Colin Rogers.
Yeah, Esteban from the clock, one of the three co-editors, my co-author. And yeah, it's
okay.
Esteban, sorry.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. My bad. David Fields. Mark, thank you for an excellent presentation. Quick question. Would you consider that Tobin's acceptance of loanable funds story or recognizes the portfolio decision-making aspects altogether fits with the approach to credit by post-Keynesian verticalists?
Yeah, well, it's not very far from the loanable funds. I think to give a very precise answer, I would need to go back to the notes that I took and what I wrote. I'm not sure, on this. So sorry, I can't give a precise answer.
Okay, so Robert, I asked you to unmute. You didn't raise your hand, but you're somehow muted.
Well, let's see if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, hello to everyone, and thank you, Mark, for an outstanding presentation, which gave me a lot to think about. It just one part of what you spoke on reminded me of one of my few interactions with these luminaries, and it's on the issue of whether the Tobin's Q theory maybe has some relationship to the work of Minsky. So this is a bit of an anecdote, but somewhere around 1995, there was a conference on macroeconomics at the Economic Policy Institute, organized, I think, by Jerry Epstein and Bob Poland. And I gave a paper on current account imbalances and the issue of the Feldstein-Horioka puzzle, which is the high correlation between saving and investment rates across countries, even though supposedly capital markets are very open. And I used Minsky's model to explain that by separating out corporate finance from other finance and showing that the correlation was mostly in the corporate sector. Anyway, the reason I mentioned that is simply that what Jerry and Bob did, and maybe there was a third organizer, I apologize if I'm forgetting someone, is that they had heterodox or post-Keynesian people be the presenters, and then they got very prominent mainstream people to come and be the discussants. So one of them was Tobin. And he was not a discussant on my paper, but I overheard him a little later saying that he really liked my paper, which I was just so thrilled with. But because I had emphasized the Minsky theory of investment and mentioned that it could be like a non-neoclassical version of Q, because except that, the marginal products don't enter. It's all based on expectations. And so that's some indicator that maybe he saw the analogy between his investment, Q-based investment theory and Minsky's. Of course, we may need to change the letter Q now. It has acquired another connotation. And if you'll pardon me a second for just another anecdote, I felt very vindicated because the first time I ever interacted with James Tobin is I was an undergraduate at Yale around 1975 or 76. And Tobin had done something a little uncharacteristically conservative, I think. He had shared a commission on the finances of the government of Puerto Rico, and which was having one of its many financial crises back then. And the commission advocated austerity. And a group of political activists, Tom, I don't know if you were in New Haven at the time or not, a group of radical students and the Puerto Rican students group got together. We staged a protest against James Tobin. And I was prominently featured in the Yale Daily News as one of the speakers at this event, although I did not go into his office. But one remarkable thing about Tobin, and I think this is really a tribute to him, is that he sat in his office and received the leaders from the student organizations and listened to them. And apparently some of them were very heated with him. And I think very few people would have done that. And so that was a tribute to him personally. I'll save my one and only Win Godley story for another time.
Okay, well, you know that James Crotty wrote a paper about Q theory, Minsky and Tobin, their interpretations, and that was published in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, and there was a reply, in fact, by, I think, Tobin and Brainard, where they were complaining that Crotty had not fully understood their viewpoint or had put them overly much into a neoclassical box. Also about Q theory, Paul Davidson has claimed that he submitted a paper to, I think, Economica in 1965, and that Tobin later published a paper that was almost identical, and which is the paper that had Q theory in it. So this is a complaint that Paul put forward, complaining that Tobin had never cited this previous paper by Paul Davidson.
So we have a question by Hassan Green. He couldn't unmute yourself, but I hope I managed to do Hassan. Hassan?
Yes, okay, thank you very much. Hello, Mark. About the consistency of the stock flow models. Everything comes from somewhere and everything goes somewhere, right? When I look at the banks, giving loans to firms, that leads to a whole series of other flows, among them the payment of the interest on the loan. And that is shown in these stock flow models. But the loan itself, the principal, so to speak, just sits there as a liability on the firm's balance sheets and as an asset for the banks, as if never repaid or paid back.
Okay, well, it depends how you present the equations in the stock flow consistent model. So either you explicitly introduce a certain ratio of repayment every period, or you don't. So in some models, this ratio of repayment is there, and in other cases, it's not. So, but yeah, there are some models where you have this explicitly, and therefore, if there is a reduction in economic activity, then the amount of loans in the system will decrease.
So I have two more questions, and I have a comment that I want to enter in the record. Jamie suggests that this is a case of the famous Galbraith law, and he has referred to it before, but I like that one, and I want to enter, if you don't know it, it's the law in economics that I thought has not been thought until the right person has thought it. And I think that that's very apropos when we discuss, like here, a lecture that involves a Nobel winner, somebody in the right institutions and whatnot, and somebody that, although he was very influential, because he was willing to push the boundaries, is very often not recognized as such. So I have two questions. So Herman Kremer, I suppose it's, and he, the question is, would the current development of digital currency, such as cryptocurrency or the electronic yuan, validate Godley's endogeneity view of money?
I think so. I don't see any reason why it would lead to a rejection of Tobin's view. I mean, are we talking about bitcoins here, or
Sorry,
simply?
didn't want to interrupt.
Are we talking about electronic money has many different meanings. It can be just un portefeuille. It can be something that you put on a card, some cash that you can put on a card, or it can be electronic cash issued by a central bank. I don't think it puts into question endogenous money or Godley's views.
Fair enough. Let me read the question by Ilan Dogus, and I think, we're at any rate approaching the end, so this might be the last question. But let's, so depending on the time, let me read this one, and then we'll see. Nowadays, another bastardization process is ongoing. New Keynesians make post-Keynesian arguments: ex nihilo money creation, bargaining power, labor share, etc., without quoting. But they misunderstand these concepts and integrate into DSG models. When and under which conditions will SFC models displace DSG models?
Well, I'd like them to do so, but there is a lot of inertia everywhere, whether it's in central banks or in academia. So, my view is just hope that heterodox economics can have some influence on some people. The influence we've seen, the influence that modern monetary theory has in the discussions everywhere. I mean, you have central bank governors who at least talk about MMT, even if it's just to say that they don't believe in MMT or they reject MMT. And MMT, at least in my view, is nothing but post-Keynesian economics, to which one has added the relationship between the government and the central bank. And then, you know, the advocates of MMT have a few specific recommendations, such as the employment of last resort. But, you know, all of the rest is stuff that post-Keynesians have been advocating for a long time.
We have one more question. We have 2 minutes. I don't know if you.
Okay.
Then, you know, thank you so much, Mark. I have a question about the endogeneity of money supply in developing countries, which their currencies are not reserve currency and their monetary policies are highly dependent upon monetary policies of the core capitalist economies. Post-Keynesian theory points out that loans make deposits higher. For instance, in Turkey, we saw that the Turkish banks demanded foreign finance as dollar credits from abroad in order to set reserve requirements for their loans created to firms before. If banks can create credit out of nothing, why Turkish banks demanded dollar credit from abroad? And is there any notion in Godley about the distinction of money creation in developed and developing countries?
No, I don't think. I think Win Godley was mainly concerned about what was happening in the UK and in the US. So he hasn't thought about development countries. The question, why do Turkish banks have to ask for dollars? And I think, again, that's the distinction between finance, initial finance and final finance.
Tell you what I got into. I got into this. Is this what you wanted, or is this not it?
Oh, that's good. So why don't you go down to
What are you?
page 32?
Oops, that was apparently a mistake. So it wasn't a.
Page 32.
So
There's no
what the
page
Turkish
numbers,
banks
but,
do, what the Turkish banks do is initial
This
finance.
today,
in their
what time?
currency, and the final finance is in dollars.
I muted the person.
Okay.
It wasn't a bomb. It was a mistake. Somebody.
Okay. So if I am to repeat, so the Turkish banks do create credit in their own currency, but then the Turkish economy is purchasing goods from abroad, and then they have to pay for it in US dollars. I mean, that's the situation.
I should say, if I may say something on this, which is a good point and brings developing countries, which, you know, obviously Win had very interesting things to say, and Mark, I'm sure you have read all of those things. So on the euro, and, you know, he very early in the history of the transition towards a common currency said that you couldn't have you know, a common currency without having fiscal policy before, and that was sort of an institutional mistake in the way it was being organized. And in many ways, that goes exactly in the direction of this question of the limits that are imposed on money creation and the ability to do even your fiscal policy if you don't have, you know, sovereign currency. I suppose it's what you know, the way MMT sort of authors would refer to this story. So, but I think that Win certainly, you know, had something to say, at least in that respect to the euro, even if he wasn't directly sort of concerned with developing countries.
Well, yes, this article that you are referring to about the construction of the euro, which was written in 1992, is part of the 10 essays or so that Win thought were most essential. And so we have them in the book that Gennaro Zezza and I edited on the writings of Win. Yeah.
Well, fair enough. Oops. Mark, you were saying something? I think my connection sort of flickered there a little bit. Okay. Well,
I was going to say that the reason for which the Eurozone went into a crisis in 2010 to 2012 is certainly a very interesting topic, and different people have a different opinion about why it happened.
Fair enough. So I think this is a good point too. We got to issues of developing countries even. And this is a good place to stop. We're 3 minutes beyond the time schedule for us. I want to thank everybody. We have had an audience that was hovering above 100. I'm sorry that we couldn't actually, sort of also live stream this. We would have had a sort of a bigger audience, but in many ways this is bigger than sometimes what we end up having at the Eastern. So that was good, and a lot of friends that normally wouldn't couldn't attend because of the conference were here. So I think that was great to see many friends. I want to thank Mark for keeping the tradition of the Godley Tobin lecture, in particular because we're trying to break the Galbraith law. We're trying to have a mix of influential mainstream authors like Robert Schiller, that Mark suggested might be somewhat favorable or have a favorable view of heterodox economics, and part of what we want to do is create something that would lend and give a platform to other heterodox economists, like the three of our previous speakers. And so I want to thank everybody. And there are many other, if you happen to be at the Easterns, there are many others that you can sort of join. I hope to see you in some other sort of meeting later on. If not, we will have certainly other rogue events before long. One with Jean-Francois Ponceau that it's around, and it's publishing a book on post-Keynesian economics with Mark. Am I wrong? With Mark.
Right.
So we're going to do something on that, and it will be in French because Esteban Perez is also willing to speak in French in meetings, and so we're going to have that, and we will have also, I should say, and we will announce hopefully soon the Godley Tobin lecture for next year, and I do hope that one is live, but we are still uncertain. So thank you to everybody.
Well, thanks for all the questions, and thank you, Matthias.